So welcome to this time together, the Gospels, for unique lens. When I started putting that up there, it said lenses. So it's now become 4 unique lens, but it's, when I was speaking with Susie and arranging this series of 5 sessions, it was important to me that we have 1 introductory session and then 4 sessions on each of the Gospels. And the way that we will treat the Gospel of John, the 4th Gospel, will not be the way that we will treat it when we do it again when we do John's Gospel again in Lent, because that will take a different really a spiritual journey perspective that's very fitting for Lent. But what I really wanted to do was to introduce us to a way of reading the New Testament that those of you who were with me back in the keynote days, and I see you here, you'll recognize that I bring a particular fondness to interpreting the texts with a full view to taking seriously the historical context that gave rise to the texts themselves. And by that, I mean this. I mean that we typically hold on, if you like, literally, to the Word of God, right? And we open our Bibles and we bring it to prayer, don't we? We'll read a passage, we'll perhaps contemplate the passage carefully and respectfully. It might be from Matthew's Gospel, the Lord's Prayer, that says, "This is how you are to pray. Our Father in heaven, hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven," or as in heaven. And we might stop and we might ponder those lines, right? And draw them close and allow them to fill us up and taste each word bit by bit by bit, just each word separately, and ask God in prayer, what is it that you mean me to hear in that reading this day, right? Isn't that what we do so often? We'll do it either when we hear the scripture on Sundays or when we read our Bible, perhaps as part of our morning prayer. And that's that drawing near of the Bible that we do. What I encourage is that drawing near also be stretched out, and that we not only draw the text near, but that we pull back from the text and look through it to the stories of those who are behind it, to that which occurred behind the text that led us to the text that we have today. And I say that because not only is it my preference, but it turns out it's a really good interpreting technique that is encouraged and in fact asked of us by our church. And so what I'm hoping to do, with your permission, is take a look at that broader context, some methods that exist around interpretation in our first session. And then we'll skip a week, mostly because I have to go out of town, but we'll skip a week. And then with our preparation from this session, we will delve into 1 gospel each week for the remaining 4 weeks. Does that sound like a plan? Okay. So what we'll do is we'll bring a historical and a cultural perspective and a Roman imperial perspective to the ways in which we understand the texts, the gospel texts themselves. But at the same time, as we stretch back and look at them from afar, we'll also each time remember to draw them close and ask ourselves those questions. Well, how does this form us? And in this, we'll have to stretch ourselves, because I truly believe that we're called to be formed as community, not as individuals. Don't throw tomatoes at me or anything like that, but the concepts that we see in the New Testament, and indeed in the Old Testament as well, have a strong focus on what it takes to form us, to knit us together as members of community. And frankly, the tradition of our church has always kind of stepped into that. And in terms of our Catholic social teaching, for example, over and over and over again, has urged us to be a people who stand in unity and compassion and mercy and love and forgiveness within a community. We're very American. And I can say that now because I became an American there back in April after 38 years of living here. I'm a little slow on the uptake in some things. But as Americans and as modern Western Northern Hemispheric people, you might say, we have a tendency to live within the individual. God is talking to me. Jesus is my personal Savior. You'll hear that language from a lot of our fellow Christian brothers and sisters. That personal engagement that we have with God and the personal attachment we have to Jesus as our brother in Christ. Don't get me wrong, I'm all for that. But I'm really going to emphasize that we begin to hear the Gospels within the context of community living, what it is to be members of a community bound together. Let me call you back for a second, just by way of wrapping up my introduction. Do you remember the days in the, 60s and 70s? It was a kind of a thing to say to people, oh, you're such a codependent. Remember that one? Oh, you're just such a codependent. Everything you do is for how you fit in with the community and how you look in front of the community. And as you know, I'm from Ireland. We lived and breathed beautiful, complacent codependence, like it was a new taste of brown bread, I'm telling you. Because everybody was kind of tied up in small towns in Ireland with each other, and what Mary was doing and what Mrs. O'Sullivan was doing and what that new young couple was doing down the road, and whether they belonged and whether they went to church or not. And everybody invested in everybody else's lives. Do you remember those days? And then we were taught to, some of you are not nodding your heads. You're actually remembering them? Yeah. And then we all strove with great enthusiasm to become individuals and to claim our own voice and to be separate and to delve down deep into what was our personal contributions and our individuality in the world. And don't get me wrong, I'm not dissing that in any way. It's a wonderful thing. But if you remember back to the days where people really were kind of engaged with each other and were caught up in how they imaged each other and how they were imaged in each other's eyes, and if you kind of harken back to those days, if you were part of them, it'll help you understand some of the concerns that we see emerge in the New Testament texts. Okay? So try to remember that kind of small community where everybody was in everybody's business, so to speak. And that'll just help you get a bit of a taste for the ways in which we step into the New Testament texts. So that's an overview of how we're going to step into things. Let me begin by asking you to do some work, okay, because you didn't think it was all going to be me. Today, what I'd like you to do to start off is something very subjective. And don't be afraid at all of being subjective. You can flick through pages or you can go back in your memory and ask yourself the questions that are up here. What's your favorite passage? Maybe you have two, that's okay. Name your favorite passage from, and when I say the New Testament, let's just stick to the Gospels, okay? What's your favorite passage from the Gospels? If you can't immediately identify one by chapter and verse and gospel, that's really okay. Okay? It is not required that you can say something like, well, the one about, the one about the leper who something or other. Okay? But try to bring to mind a particular passage that you might have an affection for, and then as you begin to think of that, ask yourself these questions. Why does it appeal to you? And what does it do for your spirituality? What kind of image does it give you about Jesus? And what is it about that appeals to you in terms of your spirituality? Okay? And then I'm going to ask you to share that very briefly, no long stories, at your table. Give each other time to speak, please. Make sure that you engage with other people, but that those of you who are over talkers, as some of us are, just rein it in a little bit. And those of you who are under talkers, just, stretch the words out just a little and be brave. Okay? And we'll just spend about 5-10 minutes max doing that, so that we really hold on to those texts that are our favorite. And we ask ourselves, what is it that's important about those? So we'll take a time out from our online broadcast, so to speak, and we'll give you some time to do that. So as we prepare to come back from finding our favorite passages, let's hear about a few of them. We'll make some commentaries on them that I think we'll be able to sustain and support then as we go through the evening. So who wants to give us one of their favorites? Okay. The Road to Emmaus. Okay. Does everybody know which that one is? Okay. It's in Luke's Gospel. It's a post-resurrection narrative. That is to say, it comes after Jesus has been raised from the dead. And what is it, Linda, that is particularly uplifting to you about it? The fact that he's walking with two disciples, we'll call them. Unrecognized.
And nobody recognizes him, and I just don't understand that. But it happened more than once after his resurrection.
Yes.
And someday I'd like to really get involved.
So a great question from Linda that she asks herself. Why is it that nobody recognizes him? He's walking with two disciples. You said apostles, and I switched to disciples because they reserved the word apostles specifically for some of those who were sent forth specifically on behalf of Jesus. We can come to that as we go through the weeks. I like what I find spiritually renewing in the Emmaus passage, the Road to Emmaus passage, is the same aspect, because I think it's the same for us today. Have you ever found yourself in a particular moment where you've been in need, or you've been almost down at the depths, and then somebody or some small group of people came and said something that all of a sudden made your life make sense? I remember specifically when my parents-in-law lost my brothers-in-law, two of them. I think I've mentioned to you in the past, they died in a car accident together. One was 18 and the other was 26. And my in-laws just, nothing makes sense of that, nothing, right? And so they're in the depths of despair. And a woman came into their life who lived right across the street, and another woman called Connie, who lived down the street, also came into their life, and both converged in on my mother-in-law, who was just an absolutely broken woman. And those two women accompanied her and talked with her. One had lost her own daughter to a gunshot wound, a self-inflicted gunshot wound that she never knew whether it was accidental or suicide, so particularly tragic. And the other had all sorts of different walks in life. And those women came into my mother-in-law's life, accompanied her with support and talk for about a year and a half, and then, rather strangely, they disappeared. They literally left her life. And we never really knew what had happened then. I mean, we didn't think any woo-hoo thoughts or anything. It's just that suddenly they were no longer part of her life, or they drifted away. Do you know, ever afterwards she said, that was a God thing. I was visited by God, walking with me, only I couldn't name it at the time. She could only name it after the event. And you know what they say was, were not our hearts burning within us? shouldn't we have known? So it's a marvelous one to hold on to, especially for when we're at the lowest of the lowest point. Just as an accidental extra comment, it is said by many scholars that it is just as likely that that was a man and a woman as it was that it might have been two men. It is often people attribute it to a husband and wife situation. Just thought I'd throw that in there. You know, I like to throw in my feminine presence when one can. Okay, who else has one that we could pick out? Okay.
Mine was in Matthew chapter 27.
Matthew 27.
My God, why have you forsaken me?
Mm-hmm.
And the reason being is because there's times where I just feel very alone.
Mm-hmm.
And that passage makes me feel very close because Jesus was very alone at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And I feel very connected to him at that moment because he was very human when we knew him as this deity, but he was very human.
Yes, yes. So tell me your first name.
Annie.
So Annie is talking about Matthew 27, where Jesus cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" And when he and how comforting it is to know that Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God, also had moments of such deep despair as we ourselves have had. And interestingly, in that particular context, it is that's that Eli Eli lema sabachthani is a text that, interestingly enough, in Matthew's Gospel, they think he's calling out to Elijah. In fact, what he's doing is he's reciting a well-known prayer from the Psalms. And that to me is a double whammy of excellence, you know, that in your moment of despair, you use a prayer to call out and to express your agony. And you know, we took a journey through the Psalms, and I hope that I at least managed to remember to say when we did our little trip through the Psalms last year that the Psalms are particularly good for lamenting. They're a marvelous opportunity for us to raise our finger in outrage to God about that which has happened. So that's a marvelous prayer for comfort. Yeah. One more. Sandy, maybe I could take the one that you mentioned? With the woman with the hemorrhage, yeah. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so just to repeat it for those who can't hear and those who are maybe listening to this as a podcast later, the particular text is the text that is sandwiched between the beginning and the end of Jesus on his way to heal the daughter of Jairus, Jairus. Remember that one? And it's in Mark's Gospel. And funnily enough, when you asked me where it was from, I think my initial reaction was to say Luke. And then I said, well, wait a minute, that's more typical of Mark, because Mark is the king of all good things that we call Markan sandwiches. A Markan sandwich is when Mark begins to tell a particular episode. Then he stops halfway through the episode. He does it at least 7 or 8 times in the Gospel. And then he stops halfway through the episode and inserts the sandwich part, another completely different episode. And then he goes back to finishing his story around the first episode. And he does it as a particular literary device, and we'll see this when we spend some time on Mark next week, or the week after next. He does it so that the outer story can inform the inner story. The outer story has Jairus' daughter being 12 years old. The inner story has a woman who has suffered from a hemorrhage for 12 years. There's a very deliberate link between the faith of the woman who touches his garment, the inner 12, and the faith that we must presume that Jairus has to be able to come to Jesus and ask for a healing for his little girl, about whom we know nothing other than that she's 12. So there's that marvelous intersection of the outer story and the inner story. When I first did biblical studies years and years ago, when I was a complete rookie in biblical studies, back in those days, in the early 80s maybe, people used to say, oh, Mark's gospel is written without much form or without much literary quality to it. It's got some mistakes in it. It's got some interesting little colloquialisms that make it seem as if it's not as worthy to be called high literature as, say, Luke's gospel, that kind of thing. The more the years go by and the more people look at storytelling and folk telling, the more appreciation has been growing in scholars for the way in which Mark has crafted his storyline. One of the things that it'll be important for you to remember is that the Gospels of Matthew and Luke rely on the Gospel of Mark for their source material. They don't uniquely rely on Mark, but they rely in a major way on the Gospel of Mark. And that's very significant for the way in which we understand how to do the interpretation of the different texts that we meet. I was laughing at myself because my first instinct, Sandy, was to say that feels like Luke, and I'm pretty sure I ran into it in Luke. I came back and checked. Luke took it over also from Mark, so Luke has it as well. So I was kind of right with my first gut response. And you'll find lots of that, and we'll deal with that as we go along. Texts that you will say to yourself, my goodness, that's strange. I think I've heard that text before. I think I heard it word for word in one of the other Gospels. And you did, except for one or two odd little phrases that were changed from one Gospel to the next, which causes us to go, oh, wait, why is that funny little change between, why did Matthew change it, or did Luke change it? We'll get into all of that. It's fascinating. It's better than the best mystery you've ever read. It's marvelous. I was thinking about my own, and I was thinking, what's one of my favorites? Okay, I'm majorly a Lucan scholar. Luke is my absolute interest. And honestly, it doesn't have anything to do with all of the drinking and eating that is in it, although that's there, of course. But in Luke chapter 13, there's a passage beginning in verse 10 of how Jesus was in the synagogue on the Sabbath. And there was a woman who had been there for 18 years, and she'd been crippled by a spirit, and she was bent over. Do you remember that one? Completely incapable of standing erect. Now, if we all stood up for a moment and bent over, just imagine how much presence you have, how much space you take up, you know? And just imagine where your eyes are cast, you know? And I just loved that she showed up on the Sabbath and she said, I'm showing up. Who knows what could happen? And she walks in, and the synagogue leader is so ticked off because how dare she show up in hope of healing on the Sabbath? Why do I love the story? Because she didn't give a darn that it was the wrong day. I love this. I loved the power of somebody who says, I'm claiming my time. I'm claiming it, and it's now. The young folks did that earlier this year and last year with this Now campaign that they were doing around gun control and all of those things. And the folks who had experienced, the women who had experienced sexual harassment and sexual abuse in the film industry also came up with kind of claiming that, no, it's now, it stops now, it's now. And so I find a lot of inspiration in this kind of sassy woman about how we know very little other than she's completely bent over and she shows up and probably nudges everybody out of the way in the slightly crowded synagogue area where they'd be gathering, and doesn't give a hoot about the fact that it's the wrong day. She should have come back on Tuesday, you know? It reminds me of some of our unfortunate church outreach, you know, where somebody comes to our churches and says, is this the day I can get a bag of clothes or a box of food? And they say, come back on Thursday at 5 o'clock or something like that. And it always breaks my heart because it's the now that is important. So those are some little gems that we hold on to. And I will strongly encourage you each week to step into the Gospels. This is one where you can just literally open a Gospel. Pick a one, open it up, find a passage, and see how it grabs you. See what emerges from holding it close. See what kinds of connections you manage to make between the deep value that the Gospel story seems to have and the context of our own lives, especially our own lives, as I said earlier, in community. So far, so good? All right. Let's see what happens when I push the button to the next slide. Sandy, this is the part that you know already. You can take a nap. Okay. Sandy is well schooled in this. We have to stop and we have to pay attention to what the Second Vatican Council told us, informed us, taught us so beautifully about how we go about interpreting the scriptures. It's so important. The reason it's important is because not a whole lot of us know that, I like to put it this way, that when you walk into the room to talk about a particular passage, for example, and let's just take Luke's cure of a crippled woman on the Sabbath, the one that I said was my favorite, chapter 13, verse 10. When we want to walk into a room, and imagine we're walking into a room of people who are all interested in that passage. I'll tell you something, that passage will have already been talked about for almost 2,000 years. And for right from the very beginning, those who were interested in understanding Jesus and who had access to the Gospels, to hearing the Gospels were all told out loud in a kind of a community setting to begin with, so they had an oral tradition that they were hearing. Those folks began to say, but what does that mean? And if the meaning wasn't clear, they said, well, maybe it has a figurative meaning. Maybe it has a spiritual meaning. Maybe it is trying to teach us something, to behave well. Maybe it has a meaning that is for after we die. Now, what I've just mentioned is the kind of interpretational method that dominated in the early church, 4 particular methods that dominated in the early church, particularly strongly through the Middle Ages, but had lasting power almost until the Council of Trent. Okay? And that is to interpret a text literally, in other words, kind of historically if you thought you could, if it looked like a historical text. If it didn't look like a historical text, you asked yourself, well, does it have a spiritual meaning? Okay, and they kind of plumbed the text for a spiritual meaning. As part and parcel of that, they asked themselves 2 other questions. They asked themselves, well, is this, what was the word for it again? It was a moral meaning. There was another word for it. It'll come back to me. Is this a text that is trying to teach me how to behave morally? And if the answer wasn't yes to that one, or it didn't seem to fit, they asked themselves the question, well, is this a question that has to do with the hereafter? Is this a question that has eschatological purposes, purposes that have to do with the end times for human beings? And so they asked themselves those kinds of questions, and only those kinds of questions, all the way up to and through the beginning of the Enlightenment period, if you like, during which time people began to discover, you know, when you look at literature, you can actually see some similarities between literature from one place and another, and maybe we should examine texts that have some similarities to see if they have some cultural nuances that we should understand. Does that make sense? And so they began this work. Originally it was Protestant scholars who began to do a lot of investigation around the Old Testament texts. And as time went by, they began to look not only at the literary features of a text, but what kind of a text is this? What form does this text have? What purpose does it seem to have? We all know about the difference between the letter from the bank that says, pay this immediately, and the letter from, they used to, what was the lottery people that you won the what was it called? Publishers Clearing House, that says, pay immediately. What they meant is, buy now, pay now, and of course you're going to win this Publishers Clearing House lottery type thing. Well, the form, the genre of both of those missives tells you exactly what to do with them. The one, I better find my checkbook. The other, in file 13, aka the trash can, right? Because you know exactly that this is marketing and trying to sell you into spending your money. But it doesn't actually have an obligation on you, right? It doesn't create an obligation on you. This from the bank, on the other hand, when it says that you overdrew your bank account by $500 and you have to immediately make a deposit, by golly, you know that that's a command performance, don't you? The genre of the literature informs you as to the meaning of the literature, and that's relevant. And so biblical scholars began to look at, biblical interpreters began to take the methods of literary analysis and use literary analysis to help inform them about the texts. So far, so good? Then what happened is they began to find ancient texts from collections of ancient texts that had been lost for many, many, many centuries and then found in the deserts of the Near East. There are texts known as the Nag Hammadi texts. There are texts known as the Dead Sea Scrolls. All of these texts were found within the last 200 years, even less for most of them, and they became available for analysis. And by golly, it told us lots of more stuff about what texts surrounded the early Christian community, and all of those findings informed archaeologists and anthropologists and cultural experts and sociologists, and all of those texts informed us about the various aspects of the world for our interests, of the first century. And all of those were, I like to say we Catholics were just a smidge cautious about all of those discoveries and about applying all of those discoveries to our biblical interpretation, because we were quite happy with, well, it's either literal or spiritual or anagogical, that was the word I was looking for, or eschatological, all of these four ways that they had been interpreting for many generations. And so we were a little slow on the uptake. And then the Catholic scholars began to gain traction and take some interest in the different methods. And by the way, you can buy a whole book. It's called something like The Interpretation of the Bible. I'll bring it next week for you. It's a little book, mine is falling apart, that I used to use in a methods class that tracks the different methods used by Christians over the course of the centuries between the time of the New Testament and today, and how we began to shift in our understanding and broaden the way in which we use different interpretational methods. But the real biggie, it began with Leo XIII, who put together a pontifical biblical commission that began to look at taking seriously the ancient culture of the Near East in interpretation. But the biggest change was the Second Vatican Council, where there is one entire document devoted to the interpretation of the Bible. It is called the Dogmatic Constitution on the Interpretation of the Bible. We like our long titles in English for our Vatican documents. In short Latinese, it's called Dei Verbum, the Word of God, Dei Verbum. We're really good with short, pithy Latin titles. And Dei Verbum is one of the, first of all, it's from the Second Vatican Council. So we know, we like our hierarchy in our teaching, don't we? We do. I'm just mentioning that in case you didn't know. We have a hierarchy of teaching in the Catholic Church, and the highest possible level of of our hierarchy of teaching is whatever pronouncements or documents come from a council of the Pope in communion with all of his bishops, and any of the documents that emerge from that. And then other lesser documents come lower on the doctrinal hierarchy. Okay, and the highest possible hierarchy of the Second Vatican Council were the documents known as constitutions. So the dogmatic constitution on the on the interpretation of the Bible is of the highest possible authority. And what is mentioned in that document is this. And I don't know if you can read it. Can you all see it? I'll read it aloud as I pull this out. It is, Holy Mother Church has firmly and with absolute constancy maintained and continues to maintain that the four Gospels just named, because this you see is Article 19, there's lots before, I saved you that. Four Gospels just named, whose historicity she unhesitatingly affirms, faithfully hand on what Jesus, the Son of God, while he lived among men, really did and taught for their eternal salvation until the day he was taken up. There's always a biblical quote, so you see that there, Acts of the Apostles. For after the ascension of the Lord, the apostles handed on to their hearers what he had said and done, but with that fuller understanding which they, instructed by the glorious events of Christ and enlightened by the Spirit of truth, now enjoyed. In other words, 20/20 hindsight, okay? Fuller understanding because of what had happened, because the Gospels were written after the resurrection and after all of the visitations and experiences of Jesus after the resurrection. And here we go. The sacred authors, in writing the four Gospels, selected certain of the many elements which had been handed on, either orally or already in written form. Others they synthesized or explained with an eye to the situation of the churches, the while sustaining the form of preaching, but always in such a fashion that they have told us the honest truth about Jesus. You know how I love to say, all stories are true. You can finish it. Some of them actually happened. Stay with me now. All stories are true. Some of them actually happened. The right question to ask is not whether the story actually happened, but how is the story profoundly true? Do we remember that from some of our previous wanderings? Very, very important. This is why it's important in terms of gospel interpretation. Whether they relied on their own memory and recollections, or on the testimony of those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses and ministers of the word, that's from Luke, their purpose in writing was that we might know the truth concerning the things of which we have been informed. In other words, you know the lovely red letters in the gospel where Jesus speaks? Don't love them quite so much anymore. Because it isn't to say that it ain't so. Absolutely not. The Gospels speak to the profound truth about Jesus, but the Gospels were compiled as a result of oral stories that circulated about Jesus, which in turn were gathered into mini collections, and then eventually were written down by Mark, first of all, or the person we call Mark, in a collection that resembled the form of a biography, a typical Greco-Roman biography. And then when the other collections and narratives wanted to be added, or wanted to be placed into the context for the Christian community so that they could preach to the profound truth of Jesus, Matthew and Luke particularly modeled their work on what Mark had put in place, and then they added and subtracted and shaped and selected, and it's exactly like your favorite quilt that was made from scraps of different materials. You know, when you take a quilt and you have all of the different materials, and each one represents whatever it was in its origin, but now it's sewn together in a completely different pattern. So you have the original piece of fabric, but it no longer is your daughter's little dress that maybe she wore when she was 1 or 2. Now it's little pieces that maybe look like a butterfly throughout the entire patchwork quilt that has been sewn together. And so what we have in the Gospels, and this is Catholic teaching, this is not me making it up, okay, it is that the gospel texts were put together by a process that involved a selection of certain texts and an omission of others, an arranging of those texts in order to make sure that the profound truth about Jesus was allowed to surface. So far, so good? Okay, in order to swallow that a little bit, you're going to have to stand up and get yourself some water and maybe a snack, and then we'll come on back and we'll resume. But you might need to shake out your worries about that one, because that usually causes people a few little shaky worries. Okay, we're coming back. How are we doing so far? This is the stuff that will root us strongly in the principles that will guide us for the next 4 sessions. So this part here is important, but it can be uncomfortable for us because it can lead us to it forces us to move to less naivete when we interpret the texts, and it moves us away from fundamentalism. And fundamentalism, I'm here to tell you, is the bane of my life personally. Whenever I have any engagement with people who would like to challenge me on different aspects of Christianity, inevitably they get halfway into their second or third sentences and I go, we don't have a common ground with which to discuss here, because you're taking everything in the Bible literally and with a fundamentalist attitude, and I don't have a way to engage in conversations if that's your methodology. And so we have to be careful about that, because I'm going to be frank about this. There's a certain amount of fundamentalism that has crept into our own tradition. Some of that because a lot of Catholics are embarrassed by not having at the tip of their tongue all of the beautifully memorized Bible passages that some of our Protestant brothers and sisters from the standalone churches have. Now, hear me well, I'm not in any way speaking about mainline Lutheran, mainline Episcopal, or Methodist, or Presbyterian interpretational tendencies, because they are typically not at all fundamentalist. I'm talking about the very worthy and wonderful brothers and sisters we have in the evangelical fundamentalist standalone churches. It's just that their methods of interpretation do not correspond with ours, because they pay no heed to the ways in which the biblical texts, especially the Gospels, were formed, and because they don't have our teaching on that. They have a tendency to bypass the historical perspective and just say, what is God telling me today, you know? And there's nothing wrong with that. It's just that when that is imposed upon an entire community in a personalist kind of way, then we have a few issues with it. So I urge us to be cautious about this and to bear in mind, let's see if I can get the next slide up, what they said in one of the most important documents that emerged from a commission as a result of Dei Verbum. A document emerged called from the Pontifical Biblical Commission in Rome, and the document emerged, this is its translation into English, and it emerged to remind us of this little bit here that I kept on the slide. From the many things handed down, they, that's the evangelists, selected some things, reduced others to a synthesis, still others they explicated as they kept in mind the situation of the churches. Do you hear each time selection, shaping, arranging in light of what they felt were the interests of each of the communities? We're going to hear this over and over again in the upcoming weeks. With every possible means, they sought that their readers might become aware of the reliability of those words by which they had been instructed. Indeed, from what they had received, the sacred writers above all selected the things which were suited to the various situations of the faithful and to the purpose which they had in mind, and they adapted their narration of them to the same situations and purpose. You're going to find that when the paralytic was dropped through the roof, remember that one? They went up on the roof and they burst through the roof. In Mark's gospel, they burst through the roof, because wherever Mark's gospel was being told to that community, they had the equivalent of an Irish thatched cottage. They had some kind of fabric on the roof that had to be kind of torn apart to let your man zoom down to the space. In the other synoptic gospels, I think it's Matthew, but it could have been Luke, it may even be in both of them, the same passage was taken up, except they're removing the tiles from the roof, because they are in a different location. They're telling the story. Now, a fundamentalist will say, well, come on, was it the tile or was it a thatched roof? And they might say, there was both. There were both. There were two different occasions, and both are true. And we Catholics would kind of say, well, you know, in the community to whom Mark was writing, that was the kind of roofs they had. So he just adapted the text for them. And in the other community, they adapted the text over here with the tiles. In other words, in Ireland we call it, we don't sweat the small stuff. Okay? So again, this is where we go back to all stories are true, some of them actually happened. That is to say, the details might be a bit off, and we try not to sweat the details. We try to stick with the profound truth of the texts. That is what really the evangelists cared about, and I can't emphasize that enough, because otherwise we'll get stuck in the weeds as we go through the weeks ahead. And so, and you see at the end there, that last little line explains those now in one context and now in another, depending on their usefulness to the readers. So every one of the four evangelists were writing with an interest to influence their readers and with a desire to have the outcome that they wanted for their readers to have. And so they were really being very strongly focused on the desired outcome. We'll see that particularly in the Gospel of John, where it's extremely clear from the get-go what his, I'm going to say, agenda. And I don't mean agenda as a bad word, but as what his purpose is, his absolute desired outcome is. He's extremely clear about it, and we'll see that as we go. Take a look at what's written in the top right-hand corner here. It's from that same document. Fundamentalism, likewise, tends to adopt very narrow points of view. It accepts the literal reality of an ancient, out-of-date cosmology simply because it is found expressed in the Bible. This blocks any dialogue with a broader way of seeing the relationship between culture and faith. Do you know that in its assessment of all of the different methods of interpretation, and there's a method of interpretation called the liberationist perspective. Some of you may remember that fell into a certain amount of displeasure in the 80s and 90s and the early 2000s. It's being brought back to favoritism again by our current Holy Father. But a liberationist perspective is a particular way of viewing gospel texts, always in light of their liberating potential, how they are how they're understandable and should be interpreted mostly for how Jesus always encourages communities to become a liberating community. And it came out of South America and was an extremely popular way of interpreting text in the 80s, but then, as I say, it fell into some displeasure, shall we say, in the Vatican. And they assess in this document, which I've saved you the many, many pages of this document by giving you just the highlights here. In this document, they talk about the liberationist perspective. They talk about the feminist perspective, feminist interpretation. They talk about sociological interpretation. They talk about grammatical and some highfalutin way of dividing sentences and understanding semiotic analysis makes my eyes just turn. And all of these, and they talk about the historical critical method and cultural method, all of these ways. And in all of them, including the feminist and the liberationist, there's no outright condemning. You know, the only one that's condemned? The fundamentalist method. They say it searches for easy answers that the Gospels are not designed to give. I say that over and over again. It searches for easy answers to life's current questions that the Gospels are not designed to give. The Gospels are designed to give us the wisdom of Christ and to help us encounter the living Spirit of Christ from the texts that speak to the life and the ministry and the passion and the death of Christ. But they're not going to fix they're not designed to give me an easy answer to life's persistent questions. As there used to be a little radio show that talked about life's persistent questions. So that's a tricky one. Are you okay with that one? Is there anyone here who's struggling with that? Because most people who hear that for the first time, they kind of go, wait a minute, how do I know what's what? Are you okay with it? You okay with it?
It's not like Luke could have picked up his smartphone and sent a text to Matthew and said, hey, Matt, what's going on with this?
Okay.
We have to, see it in, it was like 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. Now, tell me your name again. I'm sorry. Carol, sorry. Carol says it's not like Luke could have picked up his smartphone and said, hey, Matt, what's going on over there, And that's actually an excellent observation, because I like to put it this way. When Jesus walked on our world, as he went from day to day doing his ministry, which was clearly a ministry of healing and exorcism, and we'll talk about exorcism when we talk about Mark, we'll break that open a little bit next week to make sure we know what exorcism meant in the first century and so on. And when he went around his ministry, and then when he offered his life, willingly, but in the context of an authoritarian, exploitative Roman Empire. And his death then offered God the opportunity to raise him up. And that when all of that happened, nobody followed him around with a notebook, writing down at the time, gee, as he's walking into Peter's house now, I should make a note of this in case something happens that he's put to death eventually, and in case it happens that God raises him from the dead, and on the off chance that something really major happens in our world, right? Nobody followed him around writing, tracking down, or even committing to memory at the time what he was doing. They were just doing what you and I do in our world. We walk around and, as you know, I just got off the plane from Ireland, so, I'm happily rerunning stories that my brother David was telling, and little outrageous stories that my brother Peter was telling, and long stories that my sister Dee was telling, really long stories, and so on and so on. And you're just rerunning those in your head, and you're rerunning just the nice time that you've had together, and who's doing what and with whom, and all of those kinds of things. Wonderful, just family building stuff. But you're just holding on to them, and you're just living it, You're not already determining how to scribe it out. You're just there. And then something happened. And what happened was the resurrection. And there isn't a single eyewitness account of the resurrection. Not one. Which is startling when you think about it. So it's the massive mystery is the resurrection. What happened? Can we even understand it? Sometimes we say, did it really? And then we go to St. Paul, okay, not the gospel writer, but we go to St. Paul, who says, if Christ be not risen from the dead, I'm paraphrasing now, our faith is stupid and we should all go home. That was a slight paraphrase, but that's the gist of what he said. If Christ did not raise, is not raised from the dead, then Christ was not God, and we can all go home. He was perhaps a wonderful teacher. He was perhaps a great healer. He was perhaps a wonderfully skilled exorcist. All of those things, great moral leader for our times. But if he was not raised from the dead, then he is not one with the Father, and we don't have a leg to stand on. Does that make sense? So the great mystery of faith is that we accept the resurrection for which there is no eyewitness. But we have post-resurrection experiences. And I've always done it this way. I always imagine that the first thing that happens is that the women, thank you very much, the women found out that the tomb was empty. And they went, Mary of Magdala primarily went banging on the doors, oh my gosh, can you believe it? He's not in the tomb, he's raised from the dead. I actually saw him, he came to me. I didn't recognize him at first, but it's really him. God has done something extraordinary, and all of the stories start with the post-resurrection narratives. So we're going to be backwards reading in a way, because the end of the story is the beginning of the story. The after the resurrection is where the story begins. And all of the scholars, New Testament scholars who study gospel texts, will all tell you that by far the clearest evidence is that the earliest stories of the gospel were the oral accounts of the post-resurrection narratives. Oh my gosh, the women were right. We didn't listen to them, but it turns out they were right. You know, Peter didn't exactly say it that way, but they got the gist, you know. And everything initially was about he's risen from the dead. Everything has changed. We don't have to be in despair anymore. The tyrants who put him to death, as Peter says, couldn't even keep him dead. Isn't that the best? In Acts of the Apostles. You couldn't even keep him dead. And you're the ones who are proclaiming yourselves as the most powerful people on the planet. Good Lord, and you couldn't even keep him dead, because our God is better than any emperor you can give us that you're going to tell us is ruling the world with the favor of the gods. And we're here to say, actually not. The guy you put to death in the most shameful, ignominious, humiliating fashion is in fact the Lord of the universe, and you couldn't keep him dead. I mean, just all of those early stories, everything had to do with the fact that he was raised from the dead. And only after that did they begin to say, oh yeah, it was obvious, wasn't it, from the beginning? Because do you remember, he had that special way of being, and he had this extra power of even calming nature and healing people. Remember, and you go backwards then, and you tell all of the stories going backwards into his early life to say we should have seen it. We saw it coming. Sandy, you've heard me tell this story for many, many years. The river dance, you know river dance? So my brother's best friend is Billy Whelan, who wrote the music for Riverdance. He grew up in Limerick, good old Limerick, great place, producing wonderful music. And Billy Whelan wrote Riverdance, and my mother he wrote it as a 7-minute piece in the midst of something called the Eurovision Song Contest. And they needed an intermission. And they said, Bill, we need you to write us a song and dance movement thing, et cetera, and it was a 7-minute piece. And my mother calls me the next day, and after the Eurovision, and she said, I'm calling to tell you about the Eurovision. And it's kind of like the Grammys, only really zany and hokey, with only one song, and every country in Europe vies with each other to win the Eurovision Song Contest. And I said, you're calling me to tell me about the Eurovision Song Contest? And she said, no, I'm calling you to tell you what Billy Whelan's gone and done. I said, what's he gone and done? She said, he's gone and created a piece of music that makes Irish dancing go passionate. And I said, Mom, there's no such thing as passionate Irish dancing. 3 and 1, 2, 3. Do you remember how we danced? It was very stiff. No movement of the arms, tippy toes, and lots of count of a 1, 2, 3 and a 1, 2, 3, you know? And she said, yes, he has. Well, then, as you know, the 7-minute piece became an entire show, and the show is in its, 20th or 19th year now, and it's still going strong. And Bill Whelan is comfortable financially. And when we heard of that in our family and we began to see what has happened, you know what we started to say? We should have seen it all along. Should you remember when he was playing music at the house when he'd come over? Do you remember how he would always play with the drums? He was always one to mess with the beat. All of his music came from rhythm. He was never a guitar player or anything else. It was always drum, bass, drum, bass, drum, bass. And what do you know about Riverdance? The clump of the, and the multiple different measures and notes and computations that he does in terms of his musicality. We began to tell the stories of how we should have seen it. Of course, that was it, because now we had 20/20 vision. We were hindsight. We said, see, he was, and then we could see it even when he was a child. And so we began to tell stories enlightened by the R, by the river dance, we told stories about what we should have seen earlier and earlier and earlier. That's exactly the same dynamic that we have in the Gospels that we will be spending our time reading. Everything is enlightened and flavored by what they knew happened later, but they infused that enlightenment into the telling of his early days, into the telling of his healings, into the telling, even when we get to Matthew and Luke, of his childhood, even into the telling of his birth. Because there's no such thing as a heroic figure in the first century who doesn't have a spectacular birth. You just couldn't have a heroic figure that didn't have a spectacular birth. So, infused and enlightened by the knowledge of the resurrection, the evangelists composed and edited their source material so as to place the profound truth about Jesus in front of their communities. Still okay? No tomatoes coming. All okay. It's a bit weird though, isn't it? We've a tendency to say, oh, but it's gospel truth. And what we mean when we say that in our ordinary conversation is, oh, it's literal truth. It actually happened just like that. And I always want to say, well, it's gospel truth, which means it's profoundly true in a way that is much deeper and more authentic than the mere details. You okay with that? I know some of you are looking at me funny still, you know. I had a lady tell me one time that she thought she might lose her faith, you know, and I would hate for that to happen. Well, because most of us were brought up with a rather simplistic, literal way of understanding our Gospels. Because we were given them as a child, and we were given them with a bit of a kind of a magic look to them, you know? And my aim in our time together is to move us down into a much deeper understanding of how the Gospels provide us with a much more interesting lens, because we have 4 different lenses that all care about seeing different aspects of Jesus, and that each of those aspects are completely just complementary with the others, in some way contradictory, but always complementary. I had a marvelous book, I'll close with this. I have a marvelous book that I taught a class for at the university some years ago, for a number of years, and it's by Richard Burridge, much battered now, called 4 Gospels, 1 Jesus, a symbolic reading. 4 Gospels, 1 Jesus, with a question mark. A symbolic reading. And in his opening introduction, he says, you know, if you take a look at Winston Churchill, there are a series of portraits of Winston Churchill. And there's one portrait of him where he is the ultimate statesman, and he's very severe, and he's, you know, bombastic, and he's forthright and strong. There's another portrait that was put together by somebody else, which has him sitting and writing at a desk and having a kind of an artistic bent to him. Another one has him sitting alone, and another one has something else. But there are 4 portraits that if you only had that one portrait, you would think, wow, this is the essence of a man. But what you actually have is 4 completely different portraits, each of them portraying different aspects of somebody who was the one man. And so what we'll do in the 4 weeks remaining to us, not next week, but the 4 weeks after that, is we will take a look at those particular lenses, and we will see the great riches that come from actually separating out the Gospels and allowing them to be distinct from each other. And I promise you, at the end of our time together, you will never do mush Jesus again. You know what I mean by mush Jesus? Jesus mushed together as a kind of a glob of Luke-ish, Mark-ish, Matthew-ish, Johannine-ish Jesus, What you'll be dedicated to saying in the future is, well, you know, the Markan perspective on Jesus with that agent, a new agent afoot in the world, is just so liberating. On the other hand, John's perspective is so necessary for me this week. And you'll make those distinctions between where Mark's gospel feeds us and where John's gospel feeds us differently and calls us to new, different directions. Does that make sense? So please come back. See you in 2 weeks. Bring your friends. If they're fundamentalists, we're going to love them anyway, because that's who we are. And I'll see you in 2 weeks' time. Thank you for being here.